Welcome, everybody. I'm Lydia Isaac, the Vice President of Health Equity and Policy here at the National Urban League, and welcome to our January 2025 Health Equity Webinar Series session on gun violence. I'm really excited that we have three distinguished panelists here to have a discussion about gun violence prevention, the root causes, what we can do to help our communities. And so I'm going to just start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and a little bit about the organizations that they're part of, and then we'll get into the discussion. So I'm going to actually start with Karlton Harris.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karlton Harris. I am the Executive Director of the Forgotten Third. Looked like my camera froze, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Executive Director of the Forgotten Third, and we focus on preventing youth violence, promoting youth health, and providing youth opportunities. One of the key things our program primarily focuses on is increasing those protective factors to offset the risk factors of the public health approach for our young adults to become successful. Young adults are referred to our program. We have a 40-week program called Reset, and Reset stands for relationships, education, skills building, employment/entrepreneurship, and then training. We also have a partnership with UT Health Houston, where we are launching this month is actually our pilot program for our HVIP program. The Forgotten Third is a community partner for UT Health, where we'll be providing bedside service and wraparound case management for those who are referred to our program, and of course, use incredible messenger mentorship, which we do on a regular basis. So we're glad to be here. Thank you for having us, and I think that's it for now.
Gretta.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to the National Urban League for the invitation. My name is Gretta Gardner, and I am Chief Legal Officer and co-founder of Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. We are a national resource center, and we offer multiple programming with regard to interventions and prevention strategies for domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and community violence. And we do that by 4 ways. One is through training and technical assistance. So we go to jurisdictions and help with training or any technical assistance needs telephonically or in person or virtually. Outreach and engagement, our big event. Every other year we go to Essence because that's a big lift. But we love going to Essence and meeting people, hearing their stories and providing resources. Research and evaluation. We have a research team from all over the country of professors, evaluators, and researchers who help us with certain areas of our issues that we need assistance with. And then our policy. So we work on the Violence Against Women Act, the VOCA fix, and the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, as well as ancillary policy issues that impact our work, like the Crown Act and employment bills, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a pleasure to be here with you because one of our projects does address gun violence and domestic violence homicide. So it's a pleasure to be here with my other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Gregory.
All right. Well, good afternoon, East Coast folks. So Greg Jackson here. I am come to this work first as a survivor of gun violence. Unfortunately, I was caught and shot in April of 2013. And after that near fatal shooting, decided to start to speak out on this issue and also put pressure on our policymakers to take action. And so spent 10 years now advocating in different areas, helped organize the first ever hearing on urban gun violence in 2019, helped pass the first law on gun violence in 30 years, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022. And then in 2023, joined at the White House as the Deputy Director for the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. But as of a few weeks, I have been on the beach transitioning. I got a nice tan. So I not repping the organization here, but excited to talk specifically about my work in the past and what we were able to accomplish during the Biden administration, as well as some of the opportunities and challenges that we see ahead. So thankful for being here.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. And I think you kind of let us off. We all wish we could be on the beach and transitioning in this period too, but we can't. So it's important for us. I think that kind of opens the door. It's important for us to think through, and I appreciate, and we'll get a little later to what are our opportunity, but what are the challenges we have coming into the next few years on this topic. But I just wanted to start off with some grounding um, with how you all kind of see the fundamental issue of gun violence, right? So what do you think are the fundamental or root causes that we're having in our communities around gun violence, and how we prevent it, leading to prevention? What are I would say, the barriers to prevention on this issue? And anybody can take it. You're on mute still, Karlton.
Oh,
There you
sorry
go.
about that. I think one of the key issues that need to be addressed is, number one, of course, I'm here in Texas, so in the South, access to weapons, right? Our young adults can buy weapons offline, meet up with people. There are a lot of incidents where young adults are shot and killed, going to purchase a weapon illegally. Also with the access to weapons to the various gun shows, where you can go in, no background check is not being done. And of course, I'm speaking to the choir where, we really need universal background checks, right? So whereas universal across all of our 50 states, but each state operates differently as it relates to that. The other thing is looking at the social determinants of health in our underserved communities, the lack of opportunities, the lack of employment opportunities, education opportunities. When you look at schools that are in the underserved communities, the quality of teachers that they receive. When you're looking at mental health professionals, the stigma of mental health in underserved communities, where a lot of the mental health professionals do not look like our young adults. Therefore, they're not comfortable with even talking to them and having a meaningful conversation regarding whatever trauma they have already experienced. So I think that there are a plethora of different root causes that need to be addressed, where the playing field can be level for our underserved communities, as well as the communities that are highly served, where they're more prominent and more economic sound, and just really giving the young adults a level playing field where they have access to housing, they have access to, transportation, they have access, give them the opportunity. Is one thing when you fail, when you have opportunity, is another thing when it's systemic and opportunity are not provided in underserved communities, particularly brown and Black communities. And I don't believe that the system is broken. The system is not broken. The system is doing exactly what it's designed to do, and to perpetuate violence in underserved communities. It's almost like the new Jim Crow, like Michelle Alexander said a very long time ago. Is like the incarceration or mass incarceration of brown and Black people, and getting free labor and drugs being placed in underserved communities. There are so many different issues we can talk about. Food deserts, the lack of healthy eating options, but you have a liquor store almost on every corner, but there's no grocery store to go buy healthy food for, the brain development of our young adults. So yeah, I would just stop right there, because give somebody else some opportunity to say some other things. But those are some of the contributing factors to gun violence in our underserved communities.
Greta, were you going to say something?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think from my experience and background, it's been just the culture, right? The gun culture of what we mean by gun culture, who is entitled to what, and for what reason, right? I think one of the greatest shifts that we've seen in accountability is parental responsibility for access to minors to firearms, right? And I'm really interested in seeing what impact and effect that will have, to see if for those who claim to be responsible gun owners, do you keep them locked up? Are you keeping them away from children? Are you following all the protocols that, are adherent to responsible gun ownership? But when I created a forfeiture and surrender protocol in Austin, Texas, one of the things the law enforcement came to me and said, can we figure out a way to keep guns away from the people who aren't supposed to have them? And I let them kind of do all of the thinking around that. And one of the officers was like, well, I have 60 guns. And I was like, I don't understand why you need 60, and I mean, even if you're a gun collector, it just seemed like excessive, right? And so if you're an aficionado or you're a collector, like to what degree, and do you need an AK-47 and for what? So I think some of the root causes is that we're in this country, we're in a having kind of an identity crisis about for those who are originalists about, why we have a right to firearms and what that meant at that time and what does it mean at this time and what are the collateral consequences.
Yeah. Um, a lot to build on there. I mean, I think it's important to first start with really the numbers of what's happening. Over 50% of gun-related deaths are suicide. And Black youth specifically are the fastest growing share of those who are taking their own lives. But when we look at the other 48%, or really, it's really close now, the majority of it is interpersonal violence, interpersonal conflict. And only 1% of that is happening on school grounds. Only 1%, despite all the media and all the buzz and all the fear and anxiety, only 1% of those deaths are happening on school grounds. And only 11% are connected to gang-related activity, and 29% are connected to another felony. So what we're seeing, though, is we have these narratives that are dominating how we think the issue is playing out. We think it's gangs. We think it's crime. We think it's school shootings. But the numbers are not aligned with that. The numbers are aligned with interpersonal conflict between people who know each other, and they have a moment of crisis, right? Where maybe in some of our lifetimes, it used to be a fight, maybe even a knife or something or a razor, but they're having these moments of crisis. But the difference is now they have access to a firearm in that moment of crisis. And that explosion is what is really owning the lion's share of the violence we're seeing. And a lot of it is connected to domestic disputes. A lot of it is connected, over romantic circles. But a lot of it is interpersonal conflict over something that's not gang related, that's not a felony related, and is not necessarily on school grounds. And so when we thought about how to address it at the White House, we try to simplify it and say, okay, if we know there's moments of crisis and there's access to firearm in that moment, how do we try to prevent that moment of crisis in the first place? And how do we make sure that guns aren't present with those who are most likely to have that moment of crisis? And I think that approach has been really effective. I mean, the last 2 years, we've seen tremendous reductions. But when we think about addressing this, we have to figure out who is most likely to be at that moment of crisis. And when we look at the stats, we'll say, okay, this is young Black men when it comes to homicide, and it's older white men when it comes to suicide. We don't talk about that as much either, which we need to do more about. So with older white men, it's typically a moment of desperation after some financial crisis, some mental health crisis or trauma, and they decide to unfortunately end their life using a firearm. And then with our young folks, we're seeing these interpersonal explosions, but typically are not connected to anything larger. So thinking about, okay, what leads to that moment and what are the root causes that creates different stressors? And a big theme that we saw was that they have been traumatized first. So what we're watching is the people who are most explosive in these interpersonal conflicts were survivors first, whether they were shot, whether they were abused, whether they lost a loved one, their brother, their uncle, they witnessed a shooting at a party or, in their neighborhood, or they lost a friend that they loved. That trend of trauma is what fuels their likelihood to explode much faster. And so that's a huge opportunity to prioritize. We know that there's other stressors, right? We know poverty is a stressor, access to stable housing is a stressor, relationship with your family, all these other things can lead to that moment of crisis. But if we know trauma is the common strand, how do we focus on dealing with that trauma? And you see that we spoke of culture too. You even hear that in our music, right? If you listen to hip hop, and I mean, there's a rapper who literally made an album called Untreated Trauma, right? That was the name of the album. Like they're telling the stories. Like music has become this outpour of people telling stories of their trauma, but yet we aren't resourcing and helping people navigate through that trauma in a healthy way, helping them heal and recover after loss or harm. And so that needs to be a big focus. But the second big side, which Karlton spoke to very clearly, is access to firearms. We have 10 times the amount of guns that we had in the 90s, right? kids that are 12 can get to a firearm before they can get to a healthy meal. And that is a whole new reality. You know, while we may not have the same drug issue or the same crime issues of the early 90s, when you have 4 times the amount of firearms and they're being so readily accessible and they're more lethal now, like a Glock switch, you can buy something for 10 cents and turn a handgun to a machine gun, and you can 3D print it at the library. Like, this is crazy, like the type of weaponry people have to exercise and express that trauma in that moment of crisis. And so we're watching like what happened in Birmingham, where there was a dispute at a hookah bar, 16 people get shot, right? And 2 killed. Like, that's outrageous for that one moment of dispute, in a place of fun or leisure. And so I think that is like where I would really push people to think about is, one, let's make sure we see the numbers for what they are. We got to push back on the media, because the media will not tell the true story. They'll tell what sells. So we got to see what it is, and then start to really surgically get to the real issues, which were of the problems that we're trying to solve. And once I don't know, I think there's a very clear picture when you follow the numbers of where we can prioritize our efforts. And unfortunately, we have not been doing that as a country. We focused on criminal engagement and crime-based strategies. Let's go lock them up. Let's go find the bad guy, not realizing that the bad guy is not, on the corner. The bad guy is maybe in a funeral home or a hospital mourning, right? Because they're experiencing trauma and then they retaliate or they unleash it later. And so we can't just try to chase the bad guy. We have to start helping to heal and treat those who have been impacted.
So Greg, you bring a good point that I want to talk to Karlton and Gretta about. So Karlton, I want you to talk a little bit more about the program you have with UT, because I think it's getting to this issue that you're talking, that Greg is talking about. And Gretta, I want us to have a discussion about things like gun buybacks and turning in guns, and how do we get illegal guns off, if you can print one off a 3D printer, like how do we think through, there's a legal process, which is background checks and all this other stuff, but we also have this influx of illegal guns in our communities that are a lot harder to trace and get. So I want to talk about those two issues, because that goes to the root of what Greg is talking about, is the access. And, in that moment, when somebody is hot-headed, it's true. If I don't have a gun, I can't shoot somebody, right? And so how do we think through that root cause? So Karlton, I'll start with you.
Yes. So I think one way we can think through that is, of course, teaching conflict resolution. That's one thing that I'll teach our young adults here in the office. And like our partnership with UT Health is, we're launching this month is our pilot program. We go full scale in September, and it's providing bedside mentorship, job readiness training, education opportunities, just looking at, the holistic approach to those who are victims or survivors of gun violence. And to also prevent the retaliation that Greg just talked about, right? Because hurt people. And especially if it's family related. So you have family a little bit different from the gang, because if it's somebody do something to somebody's family, retaliation is probably more prominent than anything, right? And so how do we help them think through that so that they don't throw their life away down the drain? How can we encourage them to make sound decisions and make decisions based not off of emotion, right? Because sometimes we'll act and then we'll think about it later, and then now you're sitting in prison for 30, 40 years, or you end up losing your life. So I think that being able to have those meaningful conversations, with young adults. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I have one young adult, they're going to lunch right now, but in our office, they can come and work in our office. They earn $15 an hour. They work 20 hours a week. At the same time, we enroll them in Lone Star College and help them get their GED. And then look at post-secondary education opportunities for them, especially high demand jobs here in Houston, Harris County. So the HVAC, the welding, the different apprenticeships that we have available for construction. And so really leading them down that path to have them think differently, because our actions are manifestations of our thoughts, but our thoughts come from what we see and what we hear. So what we see and what we hear enter into our mind to create a thought, and then it manifests in our behavior the way that we act it out. So it goes back to what Greg was mentioning, the music videos. You hear a lot about the drugs, the popping the pills, the sipping the syrup, and putting the switch on. And so guess what? Our young adults who are listening to that, it's before their ears, watching the video, it's before their eyes. It go into their mind, and now they believe that this is a way to solve a problem. This is the way you solve a dispute. This is their conflict resolution. And we address those things here by really looking at the iceberg model, knowing that the thoughts, the feelings, the beliefs, and the emotions, those things are underneath the surface. And what we see on the top is just the behavior or the actions, but what has contributed to those, right? And so we get to the root cause of it. Let's talk about your feelings. Let's talk about your emotions. And me being a former gang member and drug dealer from the south side of Chicago who did 6 years in prison, 19 years old with an 18-year prison sentence, grow up in the 90s, involved in the gang shootouts, and that I'm relatable to them. And so it allows for me to share my story with them and also provide a solution. Some listen, some don't listen, right? And it's all about being able to really also get parental engagement when I'm working with the young adults. Because when I'm working with the young adults, some of them are being raised by their grandparents. Mom and dad are in prison or out of the home. So they don't have the grandparents don't have the energy and the effort to really deal with the 15, 16-year-old when grandma's 70, 71. So I was looking at all those different issues and really looking at a needs assessment as we're working with the young adults to provide the right antidote, which protective factors need to be in place to offset these risk factors that exist that's leading you into crime and violence. And so that's pretty much our approach. We take that public health approach, the social ecological model. We look at the individual, we look at relationship, we look at community, we look at society, we define the problem, we look at, testing those risks, those protective factors, assure widespread adoption, and then making sure that we continue to follow up with our young adults to help them become successful. I'm proud to say we have a 7.5% recidivism rate with our young adults that are in our program, and it's due to our constant contact with them. Now, the downside to it is that, my heart was just broken on December 21st because a young man who's been in my program for a year that I literally talked to every single day was shot and killed 2 hours after I last spoke to him. And so the reality is, doing this work is hard work. It's not hard work. You have to have passion and it has to be meaningful for you. But losing a young adult who's, striving to do what's right, wanting to go to college. I just did his FAFSA application with him. I just had my son get him a job at Spring Creek Barbecue, and he was supposed to start the following week. When they're wanting to do right and we're pulling them out of the streets. And of course, we know systematically a lot of the guns are being placed in underserved communities. So I understand the root causes from a policy and a government standpoint as well. But trying to meet them where they are and let them know, I see you. I'm humanizing you. You're not a number. You're not a statistic. You are a person. You are a life, and you deserve an opportunity, to live. And that's what we try to do here at the Forgotten Third, to just really level that playing field and prevent retaliation as it's going to come to our HVIP program that we're piloting here in January and launching full scale in September. Also getting to the root cause and trying to prevent it before they even get, shot. We focus on prevention, intervention, and reentry.
Greta, before I get to you, because I think there's a slightly separate conversation. I just want to, because I'm feeling this thread between both Greg and Karlton. So I'm gonna get a little personal, and if you don't want to, it's fine. But like, what helped you to see the light? So I know that you're working with young people, and like, not only did you, Karlton, you just talked about your experience. Not only did you, see things differently, but you then made you want to go and help other people. What is it what are those, was it somebody talking to you? Was it something that you saw? Like, what is it that we can try to see if we can harness that to help other young people? Does that make sense to you? Because there's clearly a thread here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think everything that we do is a learned behavior, something that's taught to us. I'll never forget 6 years old, my Uncle Smoke took me behind my grandfather's house and put a 38 in my hand and told me that I wasn't a man unless I knew how to shoot a gun. 6 years old, I still remember that. And from that point, I fell in love with guns, right? That led me down the wrong path as I grew up and seeing other family members and gang members do certain things. That's how I got into the lifestyle. The way I got out of the lifestyle was the same way. I'm sitting in prison in Illinois Department of Corrections. This is my second time going to prison. And it was for armed violence. So not only have I only been a victim or a survivor of gun violence, I've been a perpetrator of it as well. And sitting in prison the second time, 19 years old with an 18-year prison sentence, there was a gentleman named Courtney Deshaun Porter. We call him Sean for short. John I met during my first incarceration. I only stayed out 3 months and I was rearrested and went back to prison with all this time. When I got back to the prison, I tried to approach Sean with the conservative vice lord handshake. I used to be a CVL from the South Side. And he said, Karlton, I'm no longer part of that. And he began to talk to me. He accepted Christ when he was in there. He went to college, got his associate. He was enrolled in school. He's like, man, you can do so much better. And I kind of watched him like, oh, man, you soft, you know. But then as I watched him, he and I became cellmates. And I'm like, this is the same dude I used to fight with on the yard. This is the same dude I used to do this with. And he had made a totally 180-degree change. And he used his story to motivate me and encourage me. But I watched him first. And then after having this experience and being his cellmate, you know, I went to our gang leader that was in there and say, look, I'm out. I'm focused on this. This is what I want to do. And from that, it's been 24. I've been out of prison 24 years. I got out February 14th of 2000. And the same way I got into the lifestyle was by somebody speaking to me. The same way I got out of the lifestyle was by somebody speaking to me. So it's about sharing your story and those experiences. So when I talk to the young adults here, I say, look, there's nothing that you're doing or been involved in or attempted to do that I haven't done. And it's going to land you one or two places, either in prison or in the cemetery. And neither one of them, you know, is beneficial for you. So that's pretty much my story in a nutshell. Being led into the lifestyle by, you know, friends and family members and being led out of it by another former gang member who's from the west side of Chicago who talked to me and helped pull me out. And I've been out ever since, never looked back. It's better on this side. And I'm trying to get our young adults to realize that and see that.
Thank you for sharing that, Karlton. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do want, and Karlton, I just thank you for your leadership and commitment and all that you're doing. And I think what's so beautiful about Karlton's story is that someone believed in him, gave him a shot, and he took it to the moon. And he's still taking it there every day. And I think one big thing for everybody on this call is that we have to continue to give people a chance. You know, we can't give up on our young folks just because they got caught in the middle of a shooting or caught with drugs or they got in a fight in school, kicked out of school. And I think that's a huge part of the solution is we have to find the right messenger to connect, but sometimes people are just drowning. And when they're drowning, anything is a life vest. And we have to go and give them options, give them opportunities to get out of those situations. When someone's, you know, and I know one of the programs I work with that did behavioral therapy work, you know, was one of the best guys we had on our team only got into it because only joined our team because his best friend was shot and killed. And in that moment, he was in the darkest place ever. And someone said, hey, you should come work with us and help other youth who've been impacted. And he took over the whole program. And so I think we also have to figure out how are we there when people are in those like drowning moments? Like, why are we just at courthouses? Why aren't we at funeral homes? Why aren't we in more hospitals when these tragedies happen and seeing and connecting with individuals who have been traumatized, that are in their pain, that are crying, that are furious, that are throwing chairs? How can we get to them there in that moment and support them and help them, knowing that they're already in that drowning place? And I'm so thankful we have leaders like Karlton and Gretta, but all of us can play some type of role to connect with those who are most at risk and have been through so much. And it is different layers, right? Like everyone can't engage established gang member, but you can establish the younger brother of someone who was shot and killed, right? Or a mother who's lost their loved one, but maybe has 4 other kids to think about. So I just think that's a huge thing to just consider about a role we all can play.
No, thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate that. Greta, this issue of guns and getting them off the street, how do we, was your program successful? How was it successful? And how do we kind of think through replication or expansion of programs like that?
Well, it hasn't been put into place. Since my departure, we're working with the jurisdiction to update it and to get it executed. But it's not like it is not unlike other programs that are in the country. So I can certainly speak to that. But I think we're really talking about two different tracks, right? We're talking about illegal guns versus legal guns, right? And the different scenarios that are associated with those. So illegal guns, like, let's talk about that. I mean, the whole buyback gun programming is controversial. Some believe that it's not incentivizing enough. I mean, how much money do you offer? Who's actually turning them in? Is it actually the owner, or is it a family or friend member or, partner that's turning them in? And then does that cause some collateral consequences? Are people turning them in just to get money to go get a better gun? I mean, it has its pros and cons. I think it depends on who's running it and for what purpose, and is there community buy-in to that program. I think, my personal favorite, and it kind of speaks to a little bit about what my panelists, Gregory and Karlton, were talking about, who's in the community that can speak to people about why folks have guns, how they're using them, if they're illegal or legal, right? Like, just, and to encourage them to relinquish them, right? I mean, what we know is that, involuntary relinquishment does not necessarily work. It depends on why that person had one. So I think there's lots to be said about that. When I was creating the program in Austin, storage was an issue. And so that's another piece. Like, what do you do with them once you get them turned in? When I was a prosecutor in the 90s, I was able to melt them. And now people look at me like I'm crazy. I was like, that was a part of my plea deal, or that was a part of my, conditions that, give me the gun and we melt them. Some jurisdictions, police officers, they use parts of them to create other, guns. And some police departments we don't even want your guns. I worked with the ATF for Central Texas. He said, we don't even want your guns. We have so many guns in Central Texas, we're afraid our floor is going to fall out. Yeah, so I mean, that's also the biggest issue with surrender, forfeiture, relinquishment, whatever you want to call it, is storage. And what do you do with them? And how do you create that space? So we're going to partner with a gentleman who was an auctioneer who did collected evidence for the marshal's office, and it was beautiful. And he was going to do a sliding scale, and people could look at their guns, because also the problem with surrender is you are entitled to get them back under certain circumstances. And so how do you care for those weapons that do get returned? So even if you have a protection order, after the protection order expires, you have to get the gun back. You have to give the gun back. And so that's not particularly popular with law enforcement either. So where do you store them in a way that there is no liability associated for the institution that is actually storing them? Amnesty, again, some of the same issues, like who's turning it in to get the amnesty and what does that look like? And then when we talk about the legal surrender and forfeiture, and then you also have third-party transfers, does that third party know that the liability that's attached to being a third-party transferee? So for example, you come to court and say, well, I don't want to give it to the police department. I don't want to put it in a bailment situation. I want to give it to my Uncle Bob. Well, number one, is Uncle Bob prohibited from owning a firearm or possessing a firearm? So there has to be some background checks around that, right? And then two, if Uncle Bob does give you access to your weapon or your firearm, there is liability associated with that. But also, I don't even know if Uncle Bob is a real person. So, just saying that in court on the record, Uncle Bob could be a dog, right? So I need Uncle Bob to come in and understand, what his what his responsibilities are. But I would say, as far as promising practices, the right now my favorite are community intervention and co-responders, to be able to really know the tone and tenor of not only those who own firearms, but why and how the community feels about that. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to be really careful about is, you know, kind of to Gregory's point, is like, to what extent are we extending grace and understanding to some of the social determinants that Karlton is talking about? So now Maryland has a law where we are incarcerating minors for certain types of crimes. So a 10-year-old in possession of a firearm, you know, with a group of friends, or, you know, fired it off or what have you, could look at life as an adult. And so how does that serve the health and welfare of not only that individual child, but the Black community at large, when we know that we're overrepresented, right? So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Greg.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I want to jump in on this too, because this is huge. So there's I just want to add, like, there are 3 big areas that I think we can all do better at that will have a huge impact. So when we think about youth violence, the #1 source of guns that are being used to harm youth are actually coming from the home. So 80% of youth suicides, the gun came from the home. 75% of school shootings, the guns came from the home. The majority of guns found at crime scenes were stolen from a home or car. So, like, safe storage, specifically, even accidental shootings, like 74% are guns from the home. The safe storage of firearms, a lockbox, putting in the code, you know, putting your ammunition separate from the gun. Like, if we can just get adults to be more responsible in their gun ownership, we could reduce youth violence tremendously, statistically, right? Especially suicide, accidental shootings, and crime scenes, guns that are being retrieved at crime scenes. So that's a big one. And we think that we're good at storing our guns. We are not. Like, hiding a gun in the closet is not safe storage. Hiding it in the bedstand, it's not safe storage. I mean, I had one of my friends at a brunch at his house. He's former military too, by the way. Was like, yeah, you know, I say I store my guns. I have guns on every floor of my house, and I bet you can't find it. And within 5 minutes, we found it. It was in the tissue box. He had a wooden tissue box on the coffee table, and he had regular tissues on top. But imagine if a 6-year-old looks for tissue and they see a revolver there. Like, what? But that's somebody who thought they were storing it because they were hiding it. And so we have to do better at safe storage. The other big thing is, you know, when we think about illegal guns, there's 2 things that we have to do better at. One is really focus on traffickers. Like, guns are being trafficked, and as Karlton said before, people are buying them from gun shows. It's not necessarily the teen from, you know, downtown Houston. These are middle-aged adults. Many of them do not have criminal histories, that will buy guns at these gun stores, traffic them on down, and through, you know, some social media marketplace or whatever, sell guns in parking lots. And the ATF actually did a report on this, a gun trafficking report. They did 4 series, and they looked at this very specifically, and they found that the majority of them are white men without criminal history that are trafficking firearms in and putting them in the hands of primarily domestic abusers that are prohibited, but also underage and other folks who are already prohibited for multiple reasons. So we should all look at that gun trafficking report. There's also recommendations and suggestions of what we can do, but we can't just keep cracking down on the young person that got the gun if we are not storing our guns safely, and if we're not looking at who put it in their hand and being real that it's not just their friends or, you know, some person in a gang. A lot of it is someone that's been doing this for profit for years. We had one person who trafficked 100,000 guns before being caught. I mean, this is like big business. The last big thing I will say is we need more upstream accountability. So right now, all the accountability is focused on the individual that owns the gun. And even when we use terms like illegal gun, unillegal gun, that's so different community to community. You know, a handgun in downtown Chicago is illegal to a 16-year-old, but if a assault weapon is legal to a kid in Peoria, Indiana, and they live 40 minutes apart, the same age, like, how can we even really have these battles around who should have this gun versus not based on age if we don't have national policy and regulations to match that? And so it's made it really interesting and really challenging. And we've seen some communities really go through some different, frankly, I think inequitable burden when it comes to gun charges. But what we haven't done well is we haven't cracked down on the gun dealers that are selling the guns, that are violating laws. We are not cracking down on the manufacturers who are making money off of marketing to different communities. They'll market to the suburbs, you need a gun because they protesting, and then they'll market to the inner city and say you need a gun because the police won't help you. That aggressive marketing practices are a huge problem, and they're manufacturing pieces that we know are being used to harm our youth. Right? There's a whole company that manufacture ghost guns. That was a legit company in the U.S., Polymer 180, and the Biden administration, we shut them down, but they have been in business producing guns that we know have been causing homicides with inner city youth. And so we have to think about, like, it can't just be about cracking down on individuals. How are we holding the entire industry accountable? Because they're not innovating for safety. They're not innovating for responsibility. They're innovating purely for profit. And we're watching, our bodies be the result of that. So those are three things I would say. Safe storage. We got to really focus on trafficking, and cities and states can create their own policies around that. And then we have to also make sure that upstream accountability is just as aggressive as downstream. And I don't know if you saw this, but Republicans just recently introduced a law to abolish the ATF. That is the only federal entity we have to regulate upstream. So there are lobbyists that are fighting to protect these big businesses that we know are profiting, and we have to see it for what it is and make sure we're holding our legislators accountable.
Greg, you took me right into my next question. Go ahead, Karlton. Go ahead, Karlton.
I just want to add one thing about what Greg said about safe storage. Big issue here in Texas is guns being stolen out of vehicles, right? So in San Antonio alone, just last year in San Antonio, there were approximately over 2,400 guns stolen in 2024. Out of vehicles in San Antonio. I think the year before that, it was a little bit over 3,000. And the problem that we have here in Texas, of course, there are certain buildings where you can't take a firearm in, even if you have it legally, right? So they have to post a signage outside if it's 30.06 or 30.07. The law stating that you can't take the gun in. So what happens if a church has that posted, and I went to church, right? And I have my weapon on me and I know I can't take it in there. They're just leaving them in their car, like in their glove compartment or in the armrest. There is no safe storage installed in vehicles, and they're available, but the knowledge needs to get out to gun owners to be responsible. Like I partner with Be Smart, who does a lot of gun storage and locking up guns. Moms Demand Action in every town. I'm actually an Every Town fellow survivor for 2025. And one of our key things that we're talking about is safe storage, and really talking to people who are driving their cars, because a lot of the teenagers or young adults, they're ramsacking cars at nighttime. So they're going through neighborhoods around Christmas time, the holiday time, and people are leaving their doors unlocked. They're not even making it difficult for them. Not only do you have a gun not secure in your vehicle, you also didn't even secure your vehicle. So they're easily going in there, taking them out of the armrests or purses or whatever it may be. So when Greg mentioned safe storage, I do want to make sure that we look at also safe storage for vehicles as well, because that's a big issue here in Texas.
And that's really important. Thank you, Karlton. Gretta.
Yeah, just very quickly, I cannot emphasize enough how educated we need to be on what the different gun laws are in the different states, right? And so particularly as we are targeted, and there's many examples, but of the Black woman in Philadelphia who was traveling to New Jersey and was arrested for having what was legal in Philadelphia, but is not legal where she was traveling through New Jersey.
Thank you, Gretta. And so, and that's actually a really good point and really important for our affiliates, because our affiliates are in states all over the country. And I think goes to Greg's point about there's national standards and there's state standards, and then there's some standards just for your city, right? So being careful, what's the difference between when you go from different jurisdictions within the state, also is really important. And Greg started to answer this question, but I want to, and particularly I think Greta, you may be helpful in this case, is, when we think about advocacy and policy, what are the things that we need to advocate for statewide, nationally, in order to support gun violence prevention? I think it's, this group is a group that can think through some of that work. And so I'd like us to think largely, and I'm happy that Greg started the point. I think we answered it, and there's another question in the chat I'll get to in a minute about, like, this issue of the gun dealers, right? The gun traffickers. I mean dealers, sorry, they're traffickers. And I used the right word. How do we deal with the people who are bringing the guns into our communities? Because that's not a state or local problem. That's a larger problem. And anybody can take this.
Well, I'll start about advocacy. I know one thing that we're doing. So our legislative session here in Texas is every other year. And so we have the advocacy day. So on February 27th, we'll be in Austin on the Capitol advocating for various bills. One of the key bills that we advocate for is raising the age, right? It's crazy that at 18, I can go buy AR-15, but I have to be 21 to buy a 9mm. Make it make sense. I can buy a military style rifle at 18 and walk around with it, need no license, no registration or anything for it at the age of 18, but I have to be 21 to possess a handgun that can be concealed, but it's not as powerful as the assault rifle. So we do that every other year. And of course, you got local advocacy that you can do with talking to your county commissioners, your mayor, also statewide, going down to your state capital and finding out when your advocacy day. So I really want to encourage those who are listening, find out when your advocacy day and who's the organizers behind the advocacy day. So like we have an advocacy day for education and education policies here in Texas that I'll be in Austin about. And then we also have one particularly by gun violence that's led with by Everytown and Moms Demand Action. And so we partner with them and we'll be there. But letting our elected officials here, these are not just numbers. We have to humanize, gun violence. These are not just statistics. These are not just numbers. These are people who are losing their lives every single day.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump in. So we actually, in January, launched the Safer States agenda from the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and it has 15 policy changes that states can take that we know have evidence to reduce violence. So there's 15 policies. I encourage everybody to Google the Safer States agenda, White House. I don't know where it'll be after January 20th, so you might want to download it. But that's a really cool playbook on policies that can be changed. I'll just say a couple big things though. One is, we have seen for 2 years historic reductions in homicides, 11.6% in 2023, and this 2024, I think we landed around 13%. But when you look at where it's the steepest, it's in inner cities. Boston, 82% reduction. Philadelphia, 42% reduction. Baltimore, 26%. Right? These are big major cities. This is where Black and brown communities have been suffering from homicides. And we didn't see just double digits. We saw stark, historic drops. And what really happened now, I will tell you the big difference maker, it was not just that COVID was over. It was not some big policing initiative, even though policing did a great job, I'm sure. The big difference was the investment in community-based strategies. Because we made historic investments in that time. We made $400 million of investments and around $2 billion of the COVID-19 American Rescue Plan funds went into community-based programs like Karlton, like Ujima, right, like Gretta's. And so investing in them and them scaling and being able to serve more has really had the impact that we want to see. And it shows that when you invest in the people who are most at risk, you'll see results. And those results means lives saved. So the one big thing that we all can do is fight for more investment, specifically in victim services, in community violence intervention, in hospital intervention, in domestic violence reduction, trauma recovery centers. Like, let's build that, let's scale up the resources and programs we have to deal with this crisis that has been raising hell, frankly, on us. And if you want to play the numbers game, one homicide cost a city $400,000 on the low end, and on the high end, $2 million. So if you want to play the numbers game, play it. 20 homicides, that means it could be $40 million lost, right? And that math has already been done. You can go to costofviolence.org and see how they calculated that. But that's a huge thing. The second big thing is we have to push for upstream accountability policies. I cannot say that enough, whether it's dealers, traffickers, manufacturers, everybody who is profiting on this crisis needs to be held accountable the same way we do with the car industry, the same way we do with the food industry. Like, they have to be regulated, and this is the least regulated. The other big thing I will push for is we need more research. Gun violence is one of the least researched out of the top 30 causes of death in America. And so we have to pour more into what's working and exploring what else can be done, and also what's emerging, right? Like, violence is evolving fast, and it always does. And even these companies are innovating, but we don't have as many policy solutions and ideas as we need. And the last thing is the Surgeon General named this a public health crisis for the first time in history. In that announcement, he rolled out a public health approach and what that means. We have to push for that mentality shift to happen at every level. It can't just be Surgeon General in Washington. It needs to be your mayor, your city council, your county commissioners. We have a lot of work to do to get people to think about how do we deal with a health crisis, not just incarcerate our way through crime numbers. And if we can get people to shift their thinking and start to lean into some of these efforts, we'll see that transformational change we've seen the last 2 years continue. And I do believe we can make this rare. You know, we can make gun violence rare. It's not impossible. I mean, we're already back at 1950s level now. So if we just keep going, we're going to be back in a really great place. But we can't let folks oversee it. And frankly, the media is not going to help us. This has to be an organized grassroots advocacy effort to really change things. We cannot wait for another mass shooting or a high profile moment to fix everything, because that strategy will not continue to work. People are getting a little numb, unfortunately. So anyway, just want to add that. Thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic. And Gretta, I'm going to lean on you for a second, because we have a question in the chat, and then I'm going to get us to our wrap-up question that I think is really important, because, you know, you represent an organization that in particular focuses on this issue of violence against women, and particularly Black women. And so the question is, which I'm not 100% sure you can answer, but I think it gets us to talk about this issue of domestic violence, is could you all speak to the connection to mass shooters and domestic violence? I don't know if there is a connection between mass shooters.
There is.
But there you go. Well, I'll let you answer that.
There is, and I can provide the resource for that and the research, but there is that most of, or I would say the large majority of mass shooters do have a background in domestic violence, either documented or through the court, you know, through the survivor and or victim, and or through court documentation. So there is definitely a nexus there. But
go ahead.
Can I just want to add to some of the things that the other gentlemen have referred to as, like, I think on a micro level, like, to make gun violence or not necessarily gun ownership, but carrying guns unpopular in community, right? Like shops, like, guns are not welcome here, right? Like, you cannot patronize this entity if you have a gun. Guns on campus scare me terribly. I would love to see more oversight and legislation on guns on campus. When I taught at UT Law as one of the few Black professors teaching domestic violence, it gave me great pause. You mentioned something else earlier that I think that we haven't really wrapped our arms around, and whether that's policy, whether that's community organizing, advocacy, I'm not quite sure, but this 3D guns printing, how do we create oversight with regard to that? The last thing I'll just end on is that it is not unprecedented in this country to have gun restrictions. You know, when the Black Panthers had guns, we had gun restrictions immediately. So, you know, once, as I mentioned in my earlier statements, like, once we figure out what our actual gun culture is and who has access to it and who doesn't, perhaps that we can have more teeth around what we really intend to do around the Second Amendment.
Can I point to 3D printing real quick on Gretta's point?
Yes.
So 3D printing is a very scary thing. There are actually a lot of emerging threats that are coming our way. The White House actually, and I was a part of this, we're going to release a report in 2 days on all the emerging threats on Wednesday. So everyone should look at that. It's one of the last things our office is doing before it's shut down. I phased out, but there's 2 more people on the team that leave this week. So they're going to release that. So I want to encourage everybody to look at that emerging threat report. There will be recommendations. But the key is, though, there are a lot of tech solutions to these tech threats, right? Like you cannot 3D print Mickey Mouse because of trademark reasons, right? You can go in there and try all you want. You can't do it, right? And so if you can't 3D print Mickey Mouse, then we should have a plan and a strategy to not 3D print assault weapons or Glock switches or some of these other things that are really harmful. So we have to think about that. We know that guns are a big deal in the metaverse, in the VR world. Well, now's the moment. Now's the moment to start cracking down and thinking about, okay, what messages are we sending our youth and interactions are we encouraging, right? Like now's the time to start thinking about that. We know that AI is a powerful tool. Well, how do we get AI working to create solutions and starting to intercept some of these black markets online and shutting them down, right? So we have technological tools. I think we actually have way more tools than we have solutions. What we don't have is the tech world bought in to helping us fix this problem of gun violence. And the guns will continue to show up in different innovative ways as long as there's an industry that's profiting off of it. So we got to figure out how we're going to get in the game on that level. So anyway, look at that report. There's a lot of things we can do community to community first, but there needs to be some bigger effort to get the tech world bought into shifting the culture. And I know that's a whole nother webinar, Lydia. So good luck.
I don't know if I'm going to leave that one, Greg, but we'll see. So we only have 3 minutes left. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but here's what I want to end this with. A lot of the folks on this call are affiliates who are sitting in the community, in our communities, who are interacting with, our communities and helping them in all sorts of ways. If you could offer one thing for them to do, advocate for, say, or think about in this issue of gun violence prevention, what would it be? Actionable items. Let's go with actionable items.
I think the number one actionable item will be to talk to your elected officials. Let your voice be heard. And again, you may only be one person, but how many people do you know, right? Because there's power in numbers. I can call 100 people that will show up as my warm market just because they know me and my relationship, right? So we have to begin to leverage our relationships that we have with various individuals and organizations and make sure that we make gun violence a primary concern for our community. And if we don't do that, it would keep getting swept under the rug. And we know there are a lot of elected officials that just went into office. So the time is now. A lot of them ran on a narrative that they were going to help change and combat gun violence. I'm going to hold you accountable. You said you were going to do that. Accountability goes both ways. It's not just about you wanting us to get out and vote, but it's also about you doing what you're saying that you're going to do, right? And so for me is, grassroots, advocating, getting people who together and coming up with a strategy and a plan to speak with the elected officials about what needs to be done to prevent gun violence. And if you don't have the answer to what needs to be done, reach out to community organizations and leaders that are focusing on this gun violence issue, and then collaborate with them. And because we do it better together. No one person can do this by themselves. So again, grassroots, get all your people together, go speak and meet with your elected officials, and they have to listen. They work for us.
I will echo that. That is something people have heard me say a lot on these webinars. And so I appreciate you, Karlton, for saying it without me having to say it. So thank you. Gretta?
Yeah, so I would say 66% of women who are, the homicide data are women. And so I would ask, we're going to advocate zealously to increase the protections for survivors of domestic violence, that it doesn't include dating, really. Like there are all these exceptions and hoops and whatnot. So, if you want to go to our website, ujimacommunity.org, sign up to get policy alerts. And as we continue to advocate to dispossess domestic violence offenders from possessing firearms, we'd love all the help that we can get on the state and federal level.
Greg, final words before we end this.
Yeah. Look, this has to be a priority for us. And if anyone is pushing back on that, they are not paying attention. This is the #1 cause of death for Black youth in America and all youth in America. So #1 cause of death for Black men under 44. #2 cause of death for Black women under 44. It's the leading cause of death for pregnant women in America. Higher than complications with birth. Okay. And this is also the #1 cause, of newly disabled Americans. So this is raging, and it has raged in our community specifically for a long time. And during COVID, we saw these historic spikes. Now, things that we've turned a huge corner. The state of Pennsylvania down 40% from 2024 to 2023. Louisiana down 36%. Cities are figuring this out. Our policies work when you invest in programs that we know are focused on in reducing gun violence. They are seeing extremely great results. The policy playbooks exist. You don't have to figure it all out. We just got to start pushing people to invest in the resources that work and change the policies that we know can save lives. We've had 2 historic years of change. So we just have to continue to build on that. So I just want to really, really echo that this needs to be a priority for everyone. We already know what works. We got to execute. And the last thing, one thing that everyone can do, 2 things everyone can do, is that they can help educate their chapters, their families, their communities about safe storage. And you can now use Medicaid dollars to do that. So you can figure it out in your state. You can get paid to do that. But secondly, we have to do better at supporting victims and survivors, whether that's a Thanksgiving drive, a Mother's Day event, or engaging families one by one. If we invest in helping those who have been traumatized, that will also have a huge impact beyond policy and dollars. So those are the things I would say. Invest, pass the policies that work, support families that have been impacted. If we can do those big things, we'll continue to build on this momentum that we know is really saving lives. So thank you.
I just want to thank all of you. We are past time, but it's been such a good conversation. I didn't want to stop us. I just want to thank the 3 of you so much for being here. This was a wonderful conversation. And I'm going to echo a little bit what Greg just said, but what everybody said as we're hearing. I think this safe storage issue is something that Urban League affiliates could work on. I also believe Karlton made a really good point, and I want us to continue that because we also do education programs. We cannot give up on our kids. We have to continue to support our kids all the time, no matter what, because we could be that one adult that helps them change their direction. And so we just have to remember, and sometimes, it's hard because, our kids can be challenging, but we cannot give up on them. And so, and the last one is just advocacy. So I want to thank everybody. I know there was a couple of questions. I think we answered them, but one of them was for you, Greg, was how do people get the report on Wednesday? I'm assuming it's going to the Office of Gun Violence site and looking for it. Like we said, make sure you do it before Friday because it will be gone on Monday. And so it's the state of affairs right now. And so that's a lot of the things that we're going to have to, deal with and resources that may disappear. But we also know that the Biden-Harris administration is trying to, at least from what I've heard, is trying to archive and find and send those resources to people so that they are still existing somewhere in the ether. So thank you everybody for staying over for 4 minutes. Thank you for this distinguished panel. I appreciate you so much, and we will continue working on this issue. Have a great day, everyone. Happy New Year, and let's stay in the fight. Thanks.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.